Have you ever been curious how Doom did 3D? I mean, how did it look so intensely three-dimensional while not really being three-dimensional at all? Well, it in part owes that signature look and take on 3D to what's known as Sprite Scaling. What is Sprite Scaling though? Where did this first get implemented? And what did that game look like and how did it play? Well, this actually goes back pretty far. Much further than 1993 when Doom was released. Now, for this one we have to go all the way back to 1976 and a video game called Fonz. And yes, I'm talking about the Henry Winkler Fonz from Happy Days. So if you have a minute, sit back and hang out a while as we go into the early days of sprite scaling and how much it's been used in video games for years. The early days of video games were wild, full of huge advances in technology with all sorts of new ideas from Computer Space in 1971 to Pong in 1972, both of which were made by Atari, who honestly gets a lot of credit for the early days of the arcade scene, and the arcades in general. However, not to be left behind or overlooked is Sega. Most of us know Sega from their console history, but they made a number of major advancements and firsts in the arcade scene, as my channel has shown time and time again. One of these advancements happens to be a game called Fonz, named after Arthur Herbert Fonzarelli, also known as Fonzie or the Fonz. Now, the Fonz, for those of you who don't know, was a character in a show known as Happy Days. This show initially followed Richie Cunningham, showing an ideal life of the 1950s and 1960s. However, after the initial focus on Richie started to kind of wane, the show got retooled and a new focus was brought on a minor character known as Fonzie, who was Richie's friend at the time. He was a biker and a high school dropout. The new shift to the more comedic format worked, making the show a huge hit and Henry Winkler a massive star, so much so he got his own game called Fonz. This game was a first for kind of multiple reasons. First off, it was one of the first games to have a celebrity tie-in using Henry Winkler's famous character displayed prominently on the arcade cabinet. It was also one of the very first games to use a technique called Sprite Scaling. What is Sprite Scaling though? Well, simply put, it's a technique of taking a sprite and scaling it. Clever name, I know. Look, it's more interesting and more important than it actually sounds. Say you take something like a pixelated 8-bit resolution bush and use a combination of scaling it to a smaller size and positioning it higher up on the screen. In this way, it looks like it's further away. Over time, you move this asset closer and increase its scale/size and positioning it closer to the screen. In this way, it looks like the bush is actually moved towards the player. What this does is gives the player the illusion of 3D movement while using fully two-dimensional assets. This kind of technique is exactly how they made the Fonz look so much like a three-dimensional game. Well, such as it is, at least. You see, in this game you actually controlled Fonz on his bike, and you'd use the handlebars on the cabinet to actually steer him around. The idea was that Fonz was in a motorcycle race, and you had to go as fast as you could, avoiding other bikers and not skidding off the road, which is honestly pretty standard for any given racing game. What made it unique though was the 3D perspective gained from the use of the sprite scaling. They used this to make the road scroll towards the player and the other bikers scale in size as they got closer or further away from Fonz himself. Now this isn't really like a 3D game, it's pretty much kind of an isometric game, but the scaling is there. And I'll admit, it looks pretty basic because, well, it is. I mean, all of these things are when they first show up on the scene. However, it was a start in this technology, which would continue to get used in later games, like things like Space Harrier. This would make the whole game seem far more 3D in this game as you flew across the landscape with trees and rocks scrolling past you. They would just scale and move very quickly, as long as the fireballs and stuff scaling up and coming at the player. It also allowed the enemies to get closer along with the projectiles, like stated before, giving it a more fully three-dimensional feel. Terminator 2 Judgment Day was another good example of using this kind of technology, and who in the heck can forget Doom with its monsters scaling larger and larger as they move towards the player. However, what are some of your favorite games with this particular technology? Are there any modern games that use this in the indie scene that you like? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, if you don't mind, please leave this video a like. And if you haven't, consider following the channel, that helps me out a lot. For now, though, until we meet again, thank you so much for spending part of your day with me, and happy gaming.